Kenya's Supreme Court is expected to decide on Monday whether to uphold or nullify the results of last month's presidential election. The 7-member court will rule following 3 days of oral arguments last week. Opposition leader Raila Odinga, who made his 5th presidential bid, says that Deputy President William Ruto's narrow win is a product of massive fraud. 4 out of 7 of the election commissioners disowned the results announced by the commission chairperson, saying that the tallying had not been transparent. In the 2017 election, the Supreme Court made history by annulling President Uhuru Kenyatta's victory at the time over Odinga because of procedural irregularities. Kenyatta, though, prevailed in a rerun that Odinga boycotted. About 100 people were killed in election-related clashes that year. Well, for more on this, we're now joined via Zoom by Lebohang Peku, who's a senior research fellow at the Trade Collective. Lebohang, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you so much.
All right, so big day tomorrow if the Supreme Court does actually make its decision as expected. And there's been this narrative about fears of post-election violence in Kenya. I think I've heard you talk about it before. I just wonder what your thoughts are this time around. One gets a sense that things are not the same as they were in the past.
So the interesting thing about this, I think when we've spoken previously, we've spoken about a few things, and the one is this the use of the courts to deal with electoral outcomes and the judicialization of election processes and of election results, which I think poses its own interesting dilemmas and complexities, particularly in the context of contexts where we are supposed to be upholding the rule of law, and where it's expected that all of the incumbents will also have some respect for that. And I think there's a strong distinction between the clearly stolen elections, and there will often be a margin of error, particularly on many elections on the continent now and again. But one of the things that's quite ironic about this is that Mr. Odinga himself has been one of the champions for democratization, whatever that may or may not mean in this regard, and also for a lot of the constitutional reforms. What is one of the interesting and useful things is also that the Kenyan court system, legal system, has historically been extremely robust, very independent. They refused to kowtow in the previous elections when Mr. Odinga's camp wanted them to rule on election results even before all of the counts had actually come in. And then the other piece is that even in earlier this year, when Mr. Odinga and Mr. Kenyatta wanted some constitutional reforms, possibly to sway the outcomes, I don't know. Again, the Kenyan courts refused. So I think that the good thing is that there's a lot of robustness, but it does call into question whether or not it is the role of courts to take the accountability and the process of selection essentially out of the hands of the populace.
I suppose when there's a history, as we saw in 2017, of procedural errors, and at that time the Electoral Commission was pointed to by the courts, then it must be some other authority beyond the electoral process that has to decide, and maybe this is why we're here.
Maybe it is why we're here, but I mean, if we feel as though I think it calls into question, Peter and the viewers, the tenets of so-called liberal democracy, and this is where I think liberal democracy as an idea has its limitations, because ultimately it relies on the goodwill, the largesse, the maturity, and the inclination of all involved to buy into this contract. So liberal democracy is the assumption that everybody in society shares a platform, a value system around governance, and how this governance and how this power is transacted, and that the electoral process is about managing this transaction of power between different incumbents from one term to the next, but also that it gives the electorate themselves the opportunity to transact and to pronounce on whom they would want whose power they want to be, whose hands they want to be in, who should have this power. And I think that what this does is that it takes away the perspective that the people who ultimately should have the most power are the electorate themselves. And I think that the veiled threats, for lack of which frankly, that I don't think there's any other way to put it, that have been made around by some camps, that if the courts don't rule in their favor, if one result is the one that emerges tomorrow, this will lead to violence. Other than seeming as though it is really stoking up some kind of trying to stoke and anticipate a mood, a particular kind of ambience in the country, it does also call into question then why it is then, if there was such outrage after the electoral results, why that would not have spontaneously combusted before this time.
So you get a sense, I'm reading, that you believe that this time around it's a different tone around these elections, that we shouldn't be immediately thinking violence if the result doesn't go one way or another.
I don't think we should, and I actually think that it's unfair on the Kenyan electorate, on the many people who are vested in this process. I think it's also it also feeds into a very narrow kind of reporting, a very narrow kind of analysis, that all elections especially Kenyan elections have been violent. And that's just simply not true. The last two were certainly mired by particular incidences, but that would not be said to be par for the course. And I think that, we should be very careful the sort of stereotyping or the sort of characterizations that we apportion to the Kenyan electoral system per se. And also when we speak about post-electoral violence, I mean, have we ever seen anything as chaotic as what happened last year in the US, in January the 6th last year? So I think that it's also important not to pathologize ourselves as a people, as a continent per se, as well. But I think that I do think that there are deeper concerns around the merits, the demerits, the elasticity, and how we are able to form liberal democracy on this continent in a manner that's not just tick box, but that's substantive, that many millions of voting age Kenyans stayed away from the electoral processes, is in itself an act of of protest in some regard. The lack of interest, we can call it a lack of interest, apathy, whatever it is, but that in and of itself speaks volumes. And I think rather than other than only being concerned about the numbers of people who may have put their X's in the ballot box, all parties, all political parties should ask themselves, why is it that our messaging and our preposition, our manifestos, were so unappealing or so unconvincing that millions of people were not compelled to participate in any way? And that's a question for both the incumbent, the opposition, that really should be asked at a time like this. The voter turnout was lower than even in 2017, and I think especially given that this was a pivotal electoral process for the Kenyan government, for the Kenyan people, where we see this passing of the guard that's certainly taking place. Why the apathy? Why the disinterest? These are much more important questions right now that I think any political party needs to ask themselves. Why are they so unconvincing? Why are people so disinterested, in fact, in what they have to say as a political proposition?
You say passing of the guard, changing of the guard, but I guess in many respects it isn't really, though, is it? Particularly when you consider Odinga's dynasty and that Ruto has been part of this government structure for decades.
He's been part of the government structure. Ruto comes directly from KANU Youth, as we know, in the in the late 80s as well, 90s, under the heavy pupillage and tutelage of late President Arap Moi. Also share a particular, they share an ethnicity, which unfortunately means quite a lot still in Kenyan politics. So there's really nothing very fresh in any of this. And I think we've spoken again around how difficult it is to adjudicate or to think through what it means to have a new political compact, a new deal, especially in a context where the interests are largely class interests and where this is really a reconfiguration and a reconsolidation of those interests. So even though we don't have the same ethnic lines, the same narrow ethnicity, certainly money and money interests and class land interests seem to be the new currency. And what is very worrying about that is that it's even more difficult to remove that kind of architecture. It's in order to even enter the frame of Kenyan politics, it does seem as though now it is about really being part of and building the architecture of this narrow oligarchy. So even though Mr. Ruto or Dr. Ruto has fashioned himself as a man of the people, the hustler, the man who used to sell chickens, he's now the third largest landowner, one of the third largest farmers in the country as well. So you can see that even the rhetoric of being a person of the people is far outweighed by very narrow class interests. And I think what's really particularly disturbing about this is that in all of this, the electorate themselves, I don't think have been given the opportunity for even the manifestos to really ventilate, to be given life, to be articulated. There's such a strong alignment between not only ethno-nationalism, but also deep personality politics. So it looks like even now, the ODM, the Orange Movement, that Mr. Raila Odinga has been at the helm of since at least 2007 or 2006, it will probably die without him. Even a person like Mr. late President Kibaki, who came in on a KANU ticket, and then the next election he was on the NARC ticket, this National Rainbow Coalition, and then he came on a different ticket for his subsequent electoral outing. I mean, even where party political vehicles themselves are so disposable, it's fascinating, but it also begs the question: what is the anchor? What is the actual landing ground for the polity to take place, for ideas to be interrogated and wrestled with and shaped, when even the vehicles themselves seem incredibly disposable?
All right. So perhaps finally, what might be the significance of tomorrow's results, one way or the other?
Remains to be seen. Remains to be seen. I think it is looking as though, I wouldn't want to call it, but one thing that seems quite clear on the ground, and I've been sort of staying in touch with folks in Kenya fairly regularly, is that the mood this time the mood in the context of Mr. Odinga's own assertions that we was robbed once again are really not as don't really have the same currency. I mean, I think I read one report where they said that he has used the kitchen sink, the everything except the kitchen sink approach, including carrying ballot boxes, supposedly doctored ballot boxes into the courtrooms, all sorts of things. And look, far be it for anybody to protest his right to robustly contest, but I do certainly think that what will happen tomorrow should be a show of force that shows that, number one, the electorate must not be taken for granted in this way. Secondly, that election results, especially those which have been held in what seemed to be an almost cheat-proof environment. There's no such a thing as cheat-proof entirely, but what seemed to be an almost cheat-proof environment at great cost to the Kenyan fiscus as well. I think that's the other thing, that there needs to be a level of sensitivity about how much these elections actually cost. And I think lastly, how do we want to continue across the region, across the continent? What are the sorts of architecture that we want to put in place to ensure that our electoral systems are seen to be sacrosanct, to ensure that we have election commissions which are seen to be independent and robust, and that when in fact there are disputes, the legal system should not be the recourse of first resort, and that seems to be a growing trend. And I think that, again, to say that the use of the legal system and of the court system to solve what should essentially be executive processes and democratic processes, instead of leaning on the checks and balances that already exist within many of our polity, is something that I hope tomorrow will be ruled on very significantly and very forcefully. And may the best candidate win.
Lebohang, always great talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. Your insights, greatly appreciated. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
All right, that's Lebohang Poku, who's a senior research fellow at the Trade Collective, talking to us about the Kenya Supreme Court's decision, which is expected tomorrow to decide whether William Ruto's election result will stand.